everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. You ready to jump into some more fascinating history?
Always.
Yeah.
What are we looking at today?
Well, today we're going way back to the 17th century
Ooh,
to explore the very beginnings of New York City.
New York.
You might be surprised to learn that New York wasn't always the bustling American metropolis we know and love today. It actually started as a Dutch settlement
Oh, wow.
called New Amsterdam.
I did not.
It's amazing how much of New York's identity can be traced back to those early Dutch roots.
Really? That's fascinating.
Exactly. To guide us through this historical journey, we've got some great excerpts from an episode of the American History Hit podcast featuring Russell Shorto, author of Island at the Center of the World. His book really digs deep into this often overlooked chapter of American history.
Yeah.
So how did this tiny Dutch colony manage to thrive for almost 60 years, surrounded by all those powerful English colonies?
That's a great question.
And how did their unique culture shape the city that we know today?
Well, to understand the story of New Amsterdam, we first need to take a little trip back to the Netherlands in the 17th century. During this period, that's known as the Dutch Golden Age.
Right, the Dutch Golden Age. It's fascinating how they experienced this incredible economic and cultural boom while simultaneously fighting a war for independence from Spain.
It is fascinating. Shorto points to a few key factors that made this possible.
Okay.
One is their unique relationship with land.
Okay.
So imagine most of Europe at that time operating under this rigid feudal system where land ownership was concentrated in the hands of the nobility and the church.
The Dutch had a different approach.
Completely different.
Yeah.
They literally had to create much of their land by reclaiming it from the sea. This fostered an entrepreneurial spirit. And there was a saying that arose, God made the earth, but the Dutch made Holland.
Oh, wow, I love that. So they were kind of like the ultimate do-it-yourselfers.
Exactly. And this spirit of self-reliance and innovation is key to understanding their success. I mean, think about it. They pioneered concepts like shares of stock and multinational corporations, ideas that formed the very foundation for modern-day capitalism.
That's incredible. They were way ahead of their time.
And here's another key element of the Dutch Golden Age that Shorto highlights: their policy of religious tolerance.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. What made their approach to religion so unique for that era?
Well, back then, most European nations had official state religions.
Right.
And they actively persecuted those who held different beliefs. But the Dutch realized that welcoming people of different faiths actually strengthened their society.
That's interesting. It attracted a diverse population to their colony, bringing all sorts of skills and perspectives.
Exactly.
That reminds me of a story that Shorto mentions about Asser Levy, a Jewish merchant who arrived in New Amsterdam in the 1650s.
Yeah, Asser Levy. He faced some initial discrimination, but ultimately won the right to own property and serve in the militia. And this kind of openness to different faiths was just unheard of at the time. And it really foreshadowed New York's later reputation as this global melting pot.
It seems like the Dutch were really intentionally cultivating this diverse and dynamic society.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that this approach wasn't just based on altruism. The Dutch were pragmatists. They recognized that a diverse population fueled economic growth and innovation.
So tolerance wasn't just a moral principle, it was a smart business strategy.
Exactly. And it's one of the key legacies that the Dutch left on New York City. Now, with all that context in mind, let's shift our focus to the founding of New Amsterdam itself.
Okay. How did it all begin?
It all begins with an Englishman named Henry Hudson.
Ah, yes, sailing for the Dutch, of course.
Right. In 1609, Hudson sailed into what we now call New York Harbor. He was working for the Dutch West India Company, which is primarily interested in the fur trade.
So New Amsterdam begins as this humble little fur trading post.
Yes. But this company wasn't just about trading furs. It was like a proto-corporation with shareholders and a board of directors and this complex network of operations across the globe.
It's amazing to think that the Dutch West India Company had such a global reach back in the 17th century.
They really did. They were involved in everything from shipping to sugar production. Unfortunately, they were also deeply involved in the slave trade.
Yeah.
There's a dark chapter that we can't ignore when we're discussing this period.
Absolutely. It's crucial to acknowledge those complexities and contradictions of history, even when we're exploring these exciting stories like the founding of New York.
Agreed. But back to the development of New Amsterdam. A key turning point came in 1640 when the West India Company's trade monopoly was finally broken.
What impact did that have on the colony?
It opened the floodgates for deeper connections between New Amsterdam and the Netherlands. So Dutch trading companies started sending their sons to open branch offices in the colony.
Oh, wow. And New Amsterdam really became plugged in to this vibrant network of Dutch commerce and culture. It's like the colony suddenly had this direct line to the heart of the Dutch Golden Age.
Exactly. It's a pivotal moment in its development. And speaking of pivotal moments, we can't forget the legendary, perhaps even mythical, tale of how Peter Minuit, the Director General of New Amsterdam, supposedly bought Manhattan Island from the Lenape Native Americans in 1626.
Oh, yes, the classic story. The myth says he paid just $24 for the entire island.
It sounds too good to be true.
Well, you know what they say. If it sounds too good to be true.
It probably is,
Yeah,
most likely. George explains that while there may have been a deed, it's lost to history. We do have records mentioning a transaction of 60 guilders, which was later converted to $24 in the 19th century.
Wait, guilders, what are those?
A guilder was a Dutch gold coin, a common currency during that period.
Yeah.
But the real issue here isn't the exact monetary value. It's that the Dutch and the Lenape had completely different conceptions of land ownership.
So this purchase wasn't as straightforward as the traditional story suggests.
Not at all. For the Lenape, this transaction was more about forging an alliance than a simple land purchase. They didn't view land as a commodity that could be bought and sold in the same way that Europeans did.
This story of Peter Minuit buying Manhattan is the perfect example of how history is often told from a single perspective. It's only by digging deeper and considering the Lenape's understanding of this event that we get a more complete picture.
I completely agree. And what's really exciting is that ongoing translations of Dutch records are giving us a much more nuanced understanding of these early interactions between the colonists and the Lenape. It's like we're constantly refining our understanding of the past.
That's what makes studying history so fascinating. It's a constantly evolving process.
Exactly. But as New Amsterdam grew, tensions emerged within the colony itself.
Oh, what kind of tensions?
And those tensions were embodied by two very different figures, Adrian van der Donck and Petrus Stuyvesant.
Almost like a classic hero versus villain setup.
Indeed. Van der Donck was a lawyer with a humanistic education, representing the interests of the colonists, and Stuyvesant was the stern, battle-hardened West India Company man, representing the company's interests.
Okay, I need to hear more about this Van der Donck. He sounds like a fascinating character.
He really was. He arrived in New Amsterdam to manage a vast estate belonging to a wealthy landowner named Kilian van Rensselaer. This involved exploring and scouting the territory, and that's how he ended up with a large piece of land just north of Manhattan.
Wait, is this how Yonkers got its name?
You got it. His title was Jonkheer, which means young lord or squire, so his land became known as the Jonkheer's land, which over time became Yonkers. There's a little piece of Dutch history embedded in the name.
I love those little linguistic connections to the past. Okay, but let's get back to this story. What happened next in New Amsterdam?
Well, things get interesting when Van der Donck clashes with Willem Kieft, who was the Director General at the time.
Oh, so another one of these tough, military-minded leaders.
Exactly. But despite their differences, Van der Donck helped Kieft navigate this bloody war. With Native Americans, he served as a guide and an interpreter. And as a reward for his service, Kieft granted him that land. That eventually became Yonkers. But Kieft's harsh policies and conflicts with both the colonists and Native Americans ultimately led to his downfall.
And who stepped in to replace him?
None other than Petrus Stuyvesant, a man known for being even tougher than Kieft. He was a career West India Company man who had risen through the ranks, proving himself in battles against the Spanish in the Caribbean.
So he arrives in New Amsterdam in 1647, wooden leg and all.
Precisely. And his arrival sets the stage for this dramatic power struggle with Van der Donck, a struggle that would ultimately shape the fate of New Amsterdam.
Wow, this is getting intense. So much happened in New Amsterdam before the English even arrived on the scene. What are your initial impressions of this early Dutch period in New York's history? What stands out to you?
For me, it's the unexpected parallels between 17th century New Amsterdam and modern-day New York. The seeds of the city's entrepreneurial spirit, its diversity, its tolerance, they were all planted during this Dutch period. It's fascinating to see how these early roots shaped the metropolis that we know today.
I completely agree. It's remarkable how much of New York's character can be traced back to these early Dutch settlers. I can't wait to hear what happens next. In this historical drama,
Me too.
last time we left off with this clash brewing between Adrian van der Donck, representing the colonists, and Petra Stuyvesant, this strong-willed Director General of New Amsterdam. What happens next in this power struggle?
Well, in 1648, things come to a head when a representative council, called Board of Nine, is elected in the colony.
And van der Donck gets elected to this board.
He does, and he wastes no time in challenging Stuyvesant's authority. He becomes his vocal advocate for the colonists' rights and demands greater autonomy for New Amsterdam. He argues that the West India Company was neglecting the colony's needs and stifling its growth.
So he was essentially leading, like a mini revolution, right there in New Amsterdam.
It really was a revolutionary moment. And in 1649, van der Donck takes his fight even further. He sails back to the Netherlands to petition the government directly for more support for the colony.
Wow, that's a bold move. He must have been incredibly determined to make a change.
He was. It was a risky journey. But he felt it was necessary to plead his case before the Dutch authorities. And while he was in the Netherlands, he wrote this powerful document called the Remonstrance of New Netherland.
Okay, let's dive into this remonstrance. What was van der Donck arguing for?
The Remonstrance is a fascinating read. It lays out a vision for New Amsterdam's potential, highlighting its abundant resources and strategic location, van der Donck argues. That with proper support, the colony could become this thriving hub of trade and agriculture.
But he also issued a warning, didn't he? Something about the English.
He did. He warned that if the Dutch government didn't invest more in New Amsterdam, the English, who were encroaching on their territory, would eventually seize it.
Yeah.
And it's chilling how accurate his prediction turned out to be.
It's like he had a glimpse into the future. Did his efforts have any impact? Did the Dutch government listen to him?
They did, to some extent, partly due to van der Donck's advocacy. New Amsterdam was granted a municipal charter in 1653, officially recognizing it as a Dutch city.
That's a significant victory for van der Donck and the colonists. I bet that date is still celebrated in New York today.
It is. It's considered a landmark moment in the city's history. But ironically, just as New Amsterdam achieves this official status, things take a dramatic turn.
I have a feeling this involves the English.
You guessed it. Just days after New Amsterdam received its municipal charter, Oliver Cromwell, the leader of England at the time, declared war on the Netherlands.
Well, what terrible timing. What happened to van der Donck? Was he still in the Netherlands when the war broke out?
He was. And as tensions escalated, the Dutch government placed him under house arrest. It seems they were suspicious of his close ties to the colonists and worried he might stir up trouble.
It seems like van der Donck was a man ahead of his time, fighting for these democratic principles and colonial autonomy long before those ideas became widely accepted.
That's a great point. He was advocating for ideas that would eventually shape the future of the United States, but in his own time. He was often seen as a radical.
What a tragic irony. So was he ever able to return to New Amsterdam?
He was eventually allowed to return, but on the condition that he stayed out of politics. Sadly, he died just a few years later in 1655 during an attack, most likely by Native Americans, who were engaged in conflicts with the colonists. It's a sad end for a man who fought so hard for the future of New Amsterdam.
His story reminds us that history is full of these unsung heroes whose contributions often get overshadowed by the grand narratives of conquest and empire. But let's shift our focus back to the looming threat to the English, with war declared and van der Donck silenced. What was Stuyvesant's plan to defend New Amsterdam?
Stuyvesant was definitely aware of the growing English ambitions in North America. The English colonies were expanding rapidly, pushing further and further into Dutch territory.
And the English civil wars back in Europe must have added another layer of complexity
to the situation.
Absolutely.
Those wars were displacing people and creating pressures that rippled across the Atlantic and into the New World. But despite these tensions, Stuyvesant maintained this surprisingly pragmatic relationship with English leaders, like John Winthrop in Massachusetts.
Really, that's surprising, considering the rivalry between their nations.
It might seem counterintuitive, but it highlights this key aspect of Stuyvesant's character. He was a pragmatist. He knew that maintaining communication and even some level of cooperation with the English was crucial for the survival of New Amsterdam.
So it was this delicate balancing act, trying to hold on to Dutch control while navigating this increasingly powerful English presence. What a difficult position to be in.
Exactly, but even the most skilled diplomat couldn't hold back the inevitable forever. In 1664, the English made their move. They sent a fleet of warships to New Amsterdam's harbor, demanding the colony's surrender.
And this is where it all comes crashing down for the Dutch?
Well, not exactly. Here's where the story takes another fascinating turn. Despite facing a superior English force, dwindling resources, and a shortage of gunpowder in the fort, Stuyvesant managed to negotiate a surprisingly favorable surrender.
Wait, a favorable surrender? How is that even possible?
It's a testament to Stuyvesant's pragmatism and his negotiating skills. He knew that putting up a fight was futile, so he focused on securing the best possible terms for the Dutch colonists. Right. The agreement is known as the Articles of Capitulation. It's a fascinating document.
Okay, I have to know, what did these articles guarantee?
They allowed the Dutch settlers to keep their property, continue their businesses, and even hold positions. In the new English government, essentially the Dutch were allowed to integrate into English society while preserving many of their cultural and economic rights.
Wow, that's incredible. That doesn't sound like a typical surrender, where the conquered people are stripped of everything and forced to assimilate.
And it's a crucial detail that often gets overlooked in the typical narrative of the English takeover. It highlights the pragmatic nature of this transition, and it helps explain why Dutch culture remained so influential in New York, even after it became an English city.
So Stuyvesant, despite his reputation as this stern and authoritarian figure, played a key role in ensuring the city's continued prosperity and its unique blend of Dutch and English cultures.
I think that's a fair assessment. You know, he understood that the city's future depended on cooperation, not conflict. And by negotiating these favorable terms of surrender, he paved the way for a smoother transition and a more inclusive society.
It's almost like he was thinking, all right, you can have the political control, but we're keeping our culture and our way of life.
Exactly. It reminds us that historical narratives are rarely simple or one-sided. There are always more nuances to uncover, more perspectives to consider.
This deep dive is really challenging. My assumptions about early American history. Who knew that the English takeover of New Amsterdam was more of a merger than a hostile conquest?
It's a great example of how cultural exchange and compromise can shape the course of history, and it sets the stage for the emergence of New York City as this uniquely diverse and dynamic metropolis that we know today.
So the Dutch surrendered New Amsterdam in 1664, but they didn't just disappear. Their influence continued to shape the city for centuries to come. What are your thoughts on how this handover played out? What surprised you the most about the end of Dutch rule in New Amsterdam?
What strikes me is the resilience of Dutch culture. Even after the English takeover, Dutch settlers continued to arrive and trade in the city. And those core Dutch values, tolerance, entrepreneurship, a pragmatic approach to life, they all became woven into the fabric of New York City's identity. It's a powerful example of how culture can persist and adapt, even in the face of political change.
It's amazing to think about how those core Dutch values have echoed through the centuries, shaping New York City as we know it. What are some specific examples of that Dutch heritage in the city, even after the English takeover?
Well, it's important to remember that New Amsterdam didn't just instantly transform into a purely English city. Dutch settlers remained a significant part of the population, holding on to many aspects, their culture and their way of life.
Right, it wasn't just an overnight switch. So besides the people themselves, how did the Dutch leave their mark on the city?
They left their mark on the very layout and infrastructure of the city. Think about some of New York's most iconic landmarks and neighborhoods. Wall Street, for example, is a direct reference to the wall that the Dutch built to protect New Amsterdam.
It's mind-blowing. The heart of global finance gets its name from a defensive wall built by those early Dutch settlers.
Isn't it? And then there are names of entire boroughs. Brooklyn, originally Brooklyn, and even Queens, named after the English Queen Catherine of Braganza, but still holding on to that Dutch connection. Even the street grid of Lower Manhattan shows traces of Dutch influence.
It's like this hidden layer of history embedded in the city's DNA, but beyond these physical remnants. What about those less tangible aspects of Dutch culture, those values and attitudes that Shorto argues shaped New York's unique character?
Well, the Dutch emphasis on tolerance and diversity definitely had a lasting impact from its earliest days. New Amsterdam was a melting pot of cultures and religions, and that spirit of openness and inclusivity continued to thrive in New York, even as it grew into this global metropolis.
It's a spirit you can still feel in the city today, that sense of New York as a place where people from all walks of life can come together and create something new.
Exactly. And then there's that persistent Dutch entrepreneurial spirit, that drive to innovate, take risks, build something from nothing.
Is that where we get that classic hustle mentality we associate with New Yorkers? Could that have Dutch roots, too?
It's certainly a possibility. Shorta argues that the Dutch legacy of entrepreneurship was essential in shaping New York's identity as this center of commerce and innovation.
The more we explore this, the more convinced I am that those 55 years of Dutch rule were truly foundational to New York City. It's as if they laid the groundwork for everything that followed.
I think that's a great insight. It reminds us that history is full of these unexpected connections, and that the stories we tell about the past can deeply affect how we understand the present.
So big question here. If the Dutch hadn't established New Amsterdam, would New York City be the same city it is today? What are your thoughts?
That's the million-dollar question. It's impossible to say for sure, of course, but I think it's safe to say that New York City wouldn't have that same unique blend of grit, diversity, and entrepreneurial spirit without those early Dutch roots.
It's like they added something special to the city's DNA, something that set it apart from other colonial settlements and helped it grow into the global powerhouse it is today.
I agree.
Well, this has been an eye-opening deep dive. We started by thinking of New York as an English city, and we end up realizing how much of its character is actually rooted in its Dutch origins.
It's a great reminder that history is full of surprises, and that digging a little deeper can uncover fascinating connections and challenge our assumptions.
Absolutely. For our listeners who want to delve even further into this captivating history, I highly recommend Russell Shorto's Island at the Center of the World. It's a fantastic read. That will change how you see New York City.
You know, this deep dive might even spark your own curiosity about the hidden histories right beneath the surface of your own city or town.
What a great point. There are always more stories to discover, more connections to make. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.